Once I walked alive in a world wild, a heady blend of dreams and terror, hopes of heaven, fear of fire. And the world, so unkind, declined to hold my hand. Desperate, I wrought a kinder world in the unreal of a dream. If you'd seen what I'd seen, then you'd see why I fled inside of me. Bound up in my blindness like a blanket, trying my hardest to, in my heart, forget it. That harsher hue of holding my highest hopes up to the brutal, honest light. And so I lost my hunger and my wonder and my curiosity. My thirst was lost to me. Once I was a static slave, infantile, yet nothing of the grasping growth of a child. Then I heard again that clasping call of the wild. So, willing to work my better world from this one, I shall learn its true shape, and it shall learn mine. This will be the work of this wanderer's mind.
So this story is from the Cherokee tradition, and it's about a decision that the Eastern Cherokee tribe had to make. Once in the land of the Cherokee people, there lived a beloved chief called Kavlo'ai, as we would say, Sky. Chief Sky had seen many summers and winters. He had led his people through long seasons of peace. He had seen their warriors go through great battles with enemies. But now his step was slow, his hand trembled on the bow. He could no longer spot brother deer among the trees. He was no longer able to lead his people. One day in the season of falling leaves, the chief called 3 young men to him and said, "One of you will take my place and become chief and lead our people. But first, I must put you to the test." Chief Sky turned slowly, looking into the distance. "Do you see yonder mountain?" The 3 young men followed the gaze of their chief and saw a great mountain rising out of the mist in the distance. "Yes," they answered, "we see the mountain." Chief Sky pointed toward the highest peak. "I want you to go to the mountaintop. Bring back to me what you find there." This is the way he's making his decision for the leader of his people. The first young man, called Black Bear, quickly started up the side of the mountain. After the sun reached the middle of the day, Black Bear came to a wide place in the trail where he stopped to rest. He leaned his head upon a rock, and his eyes grew heavy. Just as his eyes were closing, he caught sight of 1,000 lights twinkling in the sun. Black Bear sat up straight and saw stones of great beauty lining each side of the trail. They sparkled and glowed in the sunlight. He examined a stone, carefully turning it over. "If my people had these stones, they would never be hungry again. We could trade them for food, and our lives would be better." Black Bear gathered many sparkling stones and ran down the mountain and back to his village. The children pointed to the sparkling stone and said, "See the stones Black Bear has found." He handed the stones to Chief Sky and said, "My chief, look what I have found. We can trade them for food, and we will never go hungry. We will be safe through many winters." The chief smiled fondly upon the young man and said, "You have done well, my son. Let us now wait for the others." The second young man, called Gray Wolf, climbed the mountain and went past the place of the sparkling stones. He climbed higher and higher. The trail became steep and rugged. Finally, he came to an open place where he rested beside the trail. As Gray Wolf leaned against a rock, he saw herbs, roots, and bark on each side of the trail. He looked closely at them and said, "These are the healing plants of our medicine man. If my people have these herbs and roots, they will no longer be sick and suffer. We could be healed with these plants. And he gathered one of each of the plants and hurried down the mountainside. The children waved at the elders, and they said, "See all the herbs Gray Wolf has found. We will never be sick again." He gave them to the chief and said, "We can be healed." The old chief smiled at Gray Wolf and said, "You have done well, my son. Now let us wait for Soaring Eagle, our last young man." They waited and waited. Days went by, and Soaring Eagle did not return. Still, the village waited. After 6 days, the people began to murmur. Something must have happened to Soaring Eagle. Why wait any longer? But Chief Sky said to his people, "We will wait 1 day longer." On the 7th day, as the sun cast its long shadow over the village, the people saw Soaring Eagle coming. He stumbled with bleeding feet. His clothes were ripped and torn, and he held nothing in his hands. The people were quiet as Soaring Eagle fell at the feet of his chief. Soaring Eagle spoke softly to Chief Sky. "I went to the top of the mountain, my chief, but I bring back nothing in my hands. I passed a place where there were sparkling stones, but I remembered you said to go to the top of the mountain. I passed a place where all sorts of herbs grew, but I remembered your words. The path was rough. There were great cliffs and sharp rocks. I have nothing in my hands to show you, but I bring back a story from the top of the mountain." The old chief put his hand on the shoulder of the young man. "Tell us your story, my son." "As I stood on yonder mountain and looked across the valley and beyond the farthest mountain, I saw a smoke signal. It was a signal calling for help. The signal said, 'We are dying. Come and help us.' Chief Sky, we need to go to them quickly. They are in trouble." Chief Sky stood straight before his people and the 3 young men. Pausing for a time, he lifted his eyes to the mountain and watched the mist settle on the peaks. He then turned to his people and spoke. "We need a leader who has climbed to the top of the mountain. We need one who has seen beyond the mountain to other people who are in need." The people watched as Chief Sky carefully began to remove his robe. He turned to face Soaring Eagle. "You, my son, shall wear the chief's robe." Chief Sky placed the robe over the torn clothing of the chosen young man. "You shall be our next chief, Soaring Eagle. You will lead our people and help those in need. Yes, you will be our chief and help us climb yonder mountain."
Hello. I'd like to focus these words of meditation on the 4th principle of UU, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. When we think of searching for truth, we usually think of searching for truth as without, whether we search for truth about how to address our very unjust incarceration and immigration systems or other issues. We search for truth without. But I want to turn our gaze within ourselves, and look at the truth of who we actually are. Now, to all of us, to me, it feels like I'm a coherent person, an identity. I know who I am the person who thinks, who says these words. What the real research actually shows is that's not the truth of who we are. Our minds, just have this idea of our identity. In reality, we are a complex set of modules. That's what our mind is. A complex set of modules of emotions. There is a module within us that is looking forward to watching Super Bowl tonight for some of us, and thinking about that while we're sitting here in the church. There's a module that's wondering about what the coffee will be like, or who is gathered here today, and who we need to greet and meet and so on, or what we will have for lunch later. There is a module anxious about, who got accepted to college, as we heard, or what the administration is currently doing that we don't know about. We are a very complex set of modules. That is what we are. That is what the human mind is. It is a bunch of emotions riding on top of a very small identity that presents itself as, oh, this is who I am. And that's what I'd like you to meditate on this morning. Turn the gaze of truth inside yourself and look at who you really are and what your modules really are like. So let's take a bit of time to meditate on that.
Our first reading is from a book. I think my husband's a little jealous of my relationship with it, called Thinking Fast and Slow. How many animals of each kind did Moses take into the ark? The number of people who detect what is wrong with this question is so small that it's been dubbed the Moses illusion. Moses took no animals into the ark. Noah did. The Moses illusion is readily explained by norm theory. The idea of animals going into an ark sets up a biblical context, and Moses is not abnormal in that context. You did not positively expect him, but the mention of his name is not surprising. It also helps that Moses and Noah have the same vowel sound. English teachers, that matters. And the same number of syllables. You unconsciously detect associative coherence between Moses and ark, so you quickly accept the question. Replace Moses with George W. Bush in this sentence, and you will have a poor political joke and no Moses illusion. Many of you have read Freakonomics. The follow-up to the book is Think Like a Freak, and our next reading comes from this book. There is one more explanation for why so many of us think we know more than we do. It has to do with something we all carry with us everywhere we go, even though we may not consciously think about it. A moral compass. This, for the most part, is a wonderful thing. Who wants to live in a world where people have no regard for the difference between right and wrong? But when it comes to solving problems, one of the best ways to start is by putting away your moral compass. When you are consumed with the rightness or wrongness of a given issue, whether it's fracking or gun control or genetically engineered food, it's easy to lose track of what the issue really is. A moral compass can convince you that all the answers are obvious, even when they're not. That there is a bright line between right and wrong, when often there isn't. And worst, that you are certain you already know everything you need to know about a subject, so you can stop trying to learn more.
All right. Well, hello again. So first, I want to thank Chris for inviting us down here, and it's a pleasure to be here in your sanctuary and to get some sanctuary from the cold weather in Ohio right now, where we're from. It's probably around freezing right now. Yes. So that's not fun. So I'm really glad to be here. And something that Chris didn't mention, she just mentioned when we came here, was that you guys have a really lovely labyrinth, and that was really gorgeous. I really enjoyed walking that. So I did that before the talk. I'm really glad I came early enough to walk the labyrinth. You know, it's not something we have at our home church, First to You, down in Columbus, and I'll really talk to the minister. We're having a new minister come in, so just call the minister. So need to talk to them about, considering getting a labyrinth down there. So yes, it's a really very great experience. But you know that I'm not here to talk to you about what you know. I'm here to talk to you about wise mind, the science of combining the heart and the head. And I want to do that by first sharing with you a story about one of the most emotionally traumatic days in my life. And this was only a few months ago. And I remember the day. It really started on a bright note, a really celebratory note. You know, we had friends come over, bringing pies, bringing various desserts, and we were just kind of ready for a celebration. And we sat down, we were watching TV, it was really great. And then the mood lowered as the election results started rolling in. We really were expecting, an easy win. And then just, it became really low. It was just like, whoa, what's happening down there with Ohio, our state? We can't believe 40, 60, 10% gap. Then you guys are all in Florida. We're like, oh, that was a real face palm. That's when we became really, really scared and, just went down from there. And, people started leaving, on a really down note. Then a few kind of brave souls stayed until the very end when Pennsylvania was called. That's when we knew that was it. And then it was just, everyone was just depressed and, had a headache the next morning when you had to go to work. That was just not a good day. And, I don't know, I was really shocked. I was really surprised and just very traumatic kind of experience for me. And I was looking back at that day and I was wondering, well, why was it so traumatic? I mean, the prediction market suggested that Trump had about a 25% chance of winning. It's like if you flip a coin 2 times, it's like getting 2 heads. Not that infrequent. Like, it can happen. 3 out of 4 cases, Clinton would have won. 1 out of 4 cases, Trump won. So we happen to be in the world where Trump won. I mean, but why was I so devastated? Why was I so sad? Why was it so shocking and surprising? Well, I realized that while I was kind of intellectually prepared for that, kind of my head was prepared, my heart wasn't. I just wasn't prepared to live in a world where our president was a man who just went so diametrically against all 7 UU principles. All 7 UU principles, all of them. And it was just, it was really hard for me to recognize my country. And, many people at my home congregation felt the same way at First UU Church of Columbus. I bet many people here, the Miami church, felt the same way. I mean, you guys have your vision of nurturing all families in a multi-faith world. I think that's a vision that's totally at odds with our current presidents. So, this sort of disconnect between reason and emotions helps get back at that point I was raising earlier, that we are not a coherent individuals, that we have many modules in our mind. And the 2 very relevant things that I want to talk about here are 2 systems of thinking which get at these modules. Now, the emotional system of thinking, the intuitive system of thinking, the one that was very shocked and surprised despite knowing the numbers, is called by Daniel Kahneman System 1. It's, I prefer the term autopilot system. So it's our very quick, intuitive reactions, our emotional reactions. Snaps on in a millisecond. You won't notice when it snaps on. It's meant to get us out of the way of a moving car, or in the savannah where it originated, out of the way of a tiger, saber-toothed tiger that's about to bite us. It's the system that causes us to grab, it's the survival system that gets the instinct to survive in us. It's the one that causes us to have a desire for all the honey in the savannah when we find the honey, and also since the kids are out, all the sex that we can get, because that's what causes us to survive, kind of carry our genes forward. So that's the autopilot system. Now, that's the old ancient system. We also have another system of thinking. That's the system that was like, oh, the 25%, yes, that's reasonable. That's the intentional system, what Kahneman calls system 2. I prefer intentional system. It's a much more intuitive term for it. So it's the deliberative reflective system. It takes about a second to turn on. So 1,000 times slower than the emotional intuitive system. It's also much weaker than the intuitive system. It's not nearly as strong as that system. The emotional intuitive system is a system that causes us to grab that second piece of cake when we want that cake. That I hear there will be cake today at coffee. So that's a system that causes us to grab that second piece of cake. And you know how hard it is to resist that second piece of cake. The resistance is what we're using. That's the intentional system. That's the effortful system. It's not effortful at all to grab the second piece of cake. It's also effortful to, when we hear our boss criticizing us, let's say that. Now, the intuitive emotional response is to stick our fingers in our ears and go la 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 la. Or, for some of us to punch our boss in the face. Your mileage may vary. Now, the intentional system is the one that causes us to be like, okay, let's not punch the boss in the face, let's not stick our fingers in our hands, in our ears, but let's actually incorporate the feedback and try to perform better. That's not an easy thing to do. It's not the intuitive thing to do. And so the good metaphor to use is the elephant and the rider. Now, our intuitions, our emotions are like a huge elephant that stampedes all over the place if we let it. We are the rational kind of part of ourselves that we intentionally kind of think of ourselves. We are the rider. We are the ones who stop the elephant from taking that second piece of chocolate or punching the boss in the face. That's the rider system. Now, that's the intentional system. It's much weaker. That's why the metaphor of the elephant and the rider. So our elephant, if it's flooded, will stampede out of control. However, the rider is more long-term oriented and can train the elephant. So it can change our emotions and intuitions over time to go where we want them to go, whether they're actually helpful. So it can be elephant whisperers, essentially, is the good metaphor. Training our elephant to go where we want it to go, as opposed to going for that second piece of cake. And that's the wise mind. That's the framework of combining the head and the heart to get to where we want to go and avoid bad decisions. So, going back and reassessing the Trump election, I realized that I did not have a wise mind approach to it. My emotions were not in tune with my reason. And I resolved that in the future, for such situations, I will make sure to align my emotions and my reason. If I actually think that Trump has a 25% chance of being elected, I will not feel bad or as bad if he gets elected. I will not be as surprised or shocked, because then it would not be rational. It wouldn't be wise to be so shocked. I mean, I don't need the trauma. Nobody does. But you know what? About 2 weeks ago, when Trump got into office, a lot of people were surprised and shocked by what he started doing. A lot of people. A lot of you use at my home church in Columbus. I bet a number of people here were also shocked and surprised by his executive orders. Very, very traumatizing for many people. People felt a lot of anger and outrage. But you know what? I mean, this is exactly what he said he'd do. The only thing he's not doing is trying to imprison Hillary Clinton. That's pretty much the only thing that he has, broken his promise on, not imprisoning Hillary Clinton. Well, draining the swamp, but that's a different matter. So we really shouldn't be that shocked and surprised. He's doing exactly what he said he would. And we're going to have 4 years of this, of him doing what he said he would. Perhaps he will try to imprison Hillary Clinton. Who knows? I don't think he'll try to drain the swamp. So we are essentially, if we don't align our hearts with our minds, intellectual knowing of what Trump will do, with emotional acceptance that this is what he'll be doing, will spend those 4 years, hopefully only 4, will spend those 4 years in a state of constant anger and outrage. And you know what? That's just not healthy. So the research on anger and outrage shows that that's not a healthy pattern to be in. Now, anger and outrage are useful only for short-term crisis situations. Anger, outrage pumps our bodies full of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and that really eats away at your neurons, so in your mind, kind of your ability to think well, and your gut, your ability to digest food. A lot of other systems in the body are eaten away by that. So not healthy, not good. You don't want that, because cortisol pumps up our energy, to jump out of the way of the moving car or the saber-toothed tiger. Trump is essentially a slow-moving wreck. We can't keep jumping out of the way of Trump. So the only usefulness of anger and outrage is to, from an evolutionary perspective, is to draw our attention to a problem and then take actions on that problem. So once we know what's going on and we're taking the actions, repeat negative stimuli from Trump or any other saber-toothed tiger are not helpful to outrage us. It's not helpful to have that outrage. What's helpful is to notice what's going on, say, am I paying the attention that I need to? And am I taking the steps that I decided I'd take? And then just using that anger and outrage to keep motivating the steps, as opposed to just having more cortisol pumped into your system where it won't be helpful. I'll give you an example. So Agnes and I run the nonprofit Intentional Insights that Chris mentioned. Now, when we learned about Trump, even before the election, but especially after the election, we started a project called the Rational Politics Project, which is meant to promote truth in politics. So fight against Trump's post-truth politics using behavioral science strategies, using the stuff from Daniel Kahneman, my research, other people's research. How do we use behavioral science effectively to have a wise mind of addressing lies in politics? And anyone who wants to know more about that can talk to me later. But essentially what we do is we go on radio shows, publish in venues like Time, Psychology Today, raising awareness of this issue, of how lies in politics will inevitably lead to corruption and authoritarianism. And connecting it, many people don't intuitively care about lies in politics, so we connect it to what they do care about, corruption and authoritarianism. But that's so whenever Trump does more outrageous things, lies and so on, we're like, what we do is we say, are we paying attention? Are we taking the actions that are needed? Do we need to change our actions? No, this is expected. So therefore, we'll just keep taking these steps that we decided on and use the anger and outrage to motivate these steps, as opposed to having more unhealthy cortisol pumping our systems. Now, there are a whole variety, so that's with Trump. Now, there are a whole variety of thinking errors that were described briefly in the program in the introduction that cause us to make bad decisions, that are a component of the elephant and rider framework of autopilot and intentional thinking. So one of these is the ostrich effect. The ostrich effect. So the ostrich pumps its head in the sand, which is, by the way, a myth, but that's what we're used to thinking about. That's why it's named that way. It's essentially ignoring negative information. Now, I'll give you an example. A lot of you in my church, I bet here, like to complain about Trump. They like to complain. They say, this is a bad thing, this is a terrible thing, like really, really bad. And that complaining has some usefulness. Now, there's usefulness in emotional venting, getting empathy, support, community support, and so on. There's usefulness in motivating other UUs to try to take actions, to go to protests and so on. But protests and these sorts of actions, they aren't about changing hearts and minds. They're about mobilizing allies. I bet there are very, very few UUs who actually voted for Trump. So those actions, complaining to fellow UUs, are not about changing hearts and minds. What will change hearts and minds is avoiding the ostrich effect by going to conservative people, by going to Trump voters, by going to independent voters, and talking to them, getting outside of our filter bubble. So as part of the Rational Politics Project, we go to UU congregations doing these talks. We go on liberal radio shows. By the way, I love going on liberal radio shows. It's lovely. It's like, oh, why are you right? How are you so right? How can we fix this problem? tell us how you're right about fixing this problem. You know, it's like, yes, this is what I want to hear. Stroke my ego some more. That's great. That's like venting to fellow UUs about Trump. But, you know, that doesn't change hearts and minds. It mobilizes people. It's great for mobilization, not for changing hearts and minds. I also go on conservative radio shows with people like Scott Sloan, Larry Stevenson, Dwight Lilly, really conservative people. Scott Sloan, for example, had Donald Trump on his show shortly before I went. So these are prominent people. Now, the way you get through to them is not by talking about how bad Trump is, about truth in politics. The way you get to them is saying, oh, hey, here are some lies that Hillary did. And she did some lies, you know, saying that she landed in Bosnia under sniper fire or something like that. And then you link that to something that Trump did in terms of lies. And so you start with something they care about, and then you link it to something that's also the case, that's obviously the case. And then you lead from that to saying that, well, if people lie in politics, it will lead to corruption and authoritarianism. And you give a clear lines of how, well, think about what will happen if in 2020 Trump loses the election. Now, we already know he was complaining about rigged elections. He was talking about how millions of illegal voters voted for Hillary. His Attorney General nominee, Jeff Sessions, is widely known for suppressing African American and other minority voters and promoting the false idea of mass voter fraud. How likely is it that Trump will actually step down versus that he will claim there's been a lot of illegal votes against him and have his Attorney General trump up some fake evidence about this? You know, very likely. You already have the Department of Justice under Bush was using its powers to suppress voters and trump up fake evidence about that. So I'm not optimistic about the future of American democracy under Trump. So when you talk about that, people can hear it. Conservatives can hear that because they care about authoritarianism. They don't care about truth in politics so much. So that's kind of the connection that you make when you go outside the filter bubble. And that's one of the things that is very useful of avoiding the ostrich effect and going to people's emotions, leading with emotions, not leading with reason. Now, that doesn't only apply to politics. That applies to all other areas of life, business, relationships, church life. Now, let me give you another example of a thinking error called the fundamental attribution error. Now, the fundamental attribution error is essentially our tendency to explain other people's actions through ascribing it to their internal characteristics, to their personalities, not to external factors, and ascribing our actions, our negative actions, to external factors. So I work, besides doing the professor stuff and the nonprofit stuff, I do consulting. So one of the organizations I'm consulting with right now is a large engineering consulting firm, which has a lot of technical engineers who, something like 150, who work on things like welding, so hard engineers, not software engineers. And these engineers are supposed to do marketing for the firm, but they're not really good at marketing. And they don't spend time doing that. They love their techie problems. Their nerdy problems. They love working on these things. That's what they care about, problem solving. The company needs them to do marketing in order to get sales. The sales are falling. So the HR people, the managers, they thought that the engineers were, well, either they were inherently anti-marketing kind of because they were either lazy or maybe they were just introverted, so ascribing it to internal characteristics. Now, they brought me in, and I looked at what they were doing to try to motivate engineers to do marketing, and I found that what they were doing was essentially telling engineers to get a personal brand and kind of think of themselves as a company, and that just wasn't working for the engineers. It wasn't resonating with them emotionally. They didn't care about that. So I talked to the engineers, and I saw what resonated with them emotionally was getting respect from their peers in the field and being thought leaders and sharing about their favorite nerdy, techie subjects. So reframing the language of how they talked about marketing, to talk about thought leadership, to talk about getting respect among your peers, and to talk about opportunities to share more about what you really care about, the engineers, about their techie problems, was a wonderful way of motivating engineers emotionally to do marketing. So it's external factors, not internal factors, that were the problem. And so this emotional motivation, going to people's emotions, is again about going with the heart first. Going with the heart first, not the mind first. Going with the heart first and then leading into the mind. And to share more about these sorts of problems and how to actually have solutions to these problems, I'm going to hand it off to my partner, Agnes Vishnevkin.
I love you guys having this step, by the way. You took my papers?
Oh, did I?
Some teamwork this is.
These are my papers. Oh, here it is.
Just a second. Perfect, thank you. So Gleb covered 2 thinking errors that are commonly caused by this interaction of our autopilot elephant and our intentional thinking rider. And by the way, afterwards I look forward to checking in with you, and I would be happy to show you, actually, I have a tattoo to scale of the elephant and the rider that remind me to, whenever I make decisions or have emotional difficulties, this is what I usually guide. So I have it to scale, to remember just how powerful the elephant is and how hard it is for the rider to train the elephant and to remind it. And so whenever the emotions are strong, that's because how large the elephant is compared to a rider. So our third thinking error we're going to talk about today is the confirmation bias. And the confirmation bias is our tendency to interpret new evidence as confirming our existing beliefs and expectations. So it's basically whatever we think, whatever we believe, and we take in new information, and we're like, yes, that confirms what I believe. That can really block out a lot of new information. And so here's one example that is perhaps relevant to this congregation that we're sitting in this morning. So I know that here you guys use a consulting minister model. And I know that this works great. We've talked to some leaders before coming down here, and I know that this helps the congregation live within its means, have a stronger congregation, and, it was a great decision. However, imagine a UU visitor coming in for the first time, perhaps even someone here in this room who is used to being in a UU congregation with a permanent, settled minister. And imagine this person, they might very well be surprised and concerned that there's no permanent settled minister over here. As they get to know the congregation and they notice something that they don't like, something that's problematic, they're actually very likely to blame it on this minister model, since they already decided that it's negative. They would also be blinded, potentially, to seeing the strengths and capacities and the opportunities of this consulting minister model. They might think it's a weakness because, again, they might have already decided it emotionally, automatically, based on their past experiences. And so new evidence would be used to confirm their beliefs, and they might not see new evidence. So that is the confirmation bias. And I'm going to touch later on how to address it. And then finally, our fourth bias, our fourth thinking error this morning is the attentional bias. And that is the tendency of our thinking to be affected by what is most important to us or what is repeated most often. So it gets our attention. That's why it's attentional bias, if we hear it a lot or if it's just something our mind is set on. And so here's an example of attentional bias that's connected to crime and mental illness. A few months ago, I talked to Joanne Viviano, and she is a reporter at the Columbus Dispatch, the largest paper in Ohio. She was complaining about a problem that she's noticed in reporting, and she has over 20 years of experience in this industry. And she says that very often when a crime is committed by a person with a mental illness, the news story mentions that they have a mental illness. Now, whether this mental illness impacted this crime or was related anyway, it doesn't matter. She just says it's always in the paper, it's always in the news, it's always on TV. Without any connection, the connection is not discussed. It may or may not be there. Now, what kind of oppression does that leave of people with mental health challenges? It tells us that mental illness is associated with crime. Again, like Gleb was saying before, our emotions, our intuitions, our elephant, so large, so powerful, and so fast. So when we hear mental illness and crime in the same sentence, if we don't trigger our intentional, hardworking writer to think about it, boom, that's where we just end up. This is where the attention is drawn. It seems important. It seems relevant. Our attentional bias tells us that mental illness goes with crime. Joanne Viviano tries to fight this. She often talks to fellow reporters about the negative consequences of their actions. But she's just one person. And this continues to be a trend, unfortunately, in news reporting. And it contributes to the stigma around mental illness. And it affects a lot of people, the stigma, because approximately 1 in 5 adults in the United States experiences mental illness in a given year. In fact, both I and Gleb are suffering with mental illness. It's something that we struggle with every day, even as we run Intentional Insights and travel to give talks like this. And based on statistics, I'm sure there's a fair number of folks with mental illness currently or in the past or in their family here in this room. So that covers the attentional bias. Now we talked about these thinking errors, these biases. Let's talk about solutions. Let's talk about how to fix this. And these solutions are based on research. And this branch of research is called debiasing research, not surprising. And so we're going to talk about 4 ways to fight against these errors. The first one is to imagine. Imagine other explanations for what you see and try to figure out why this explanation might be right. So use your imagination. Let's go back to the example that Gleb was talking about with engineers who are doing their bestest, darndest best to avoid marketing. Now, why are they avoiding it? The managers, the first they think about is they're lazy, they're introverted. Again, because of the fundamental attribution error, it's attributed to the people that they are. And, it's not flattering. Now, let's think for a moment, what might be other explanations why engineers might be avoiding marketing? Maybe they spend a lot of time working on their favorite technical problems and helping their clients. They're too busy. Or maybe they love to talk about their favorite, technical solutions and engineering discoveries and tricks. And so they don't talk about marketing because they don't like it. Doesn't make them bad people. They're doing something else. And so this is an example. When we imagine other explanations, when we consider them, it makes us more open to evidence. It makes us more open to considering what else might be there. And it can help us discover this evidence. And so again, in Gleb's example, when he did this, he discovered that the engineers just didn't have the right emotional incentives and that there's a way to change that. Our second research-based strategy today is to notice when you're surprised. Notice when you're surprised and notice when you're confused. I think with Intentional Insights, we're making actually t-shirts that say, I notice I'm confused. So it's kind of fun to wear around town. But really, it's a very popular strategy. And so say I'm visiting this congregation for the first time, and the previous UU congregation I attended has a settled minister. And here I come in, and I'm told there's no permanent minister. And I'm confused, and I'm surprised. It would be very important for me to notice it, to notice this discomfort, and to reflect. And like the meditation was a little bit ago, Gleb was telling us to look for the truth in us. So I would sit with my confusion. I would sit with my concern and think about, where is it coming from? Am I cold? Am I hungry? Did this person look at me wrong? No. It's because it's so strange that there's not a settled minister. Is this a problem? I'm confused. When I discover that that is the source, I can be free to look for additional information instead of just rushing to decide that this is a problem just because of what my giant autopilot elephant tells me what to do. And then I would talk to someone in the congregation, I would talk to a leader, and they would tell me why the consulting minister model exists, what are its benefits, what are its strengths, and how wonderful the congregation is and what a great community it is. Boom, my problem is solved, and I have an accurate perception of the world, just because I noticed my surprise and my confusion. The next science-based strategy is looking at the long term, orienting toward the long term. So ask yourself, what are your goals for the future? What world do you want to live in a year from now? And now think about the next questions. Do your actions serve those goals? Will your actions actually bring about this world that you want to live in? So again, focusing on this long term, at least a year in the future, maybe 5. And so here we can go back to the example of complaining to each other about, how frustrated we are with the election of President Trump. We can complain and be outraged and be upset, but does this serve your goals? Would this complaining bring about the world you want to live in? Now, there's no right answer, and I'm not going to pretend that I know, what your goals are. That's why it's a question for each and every one of you. But I have some ideas for what complaining might bring about, and each of us can decide whether it meets our goals. For example, some of the things that you might bring about by complaining to fellow UUs is, again, receiving emotional support, feeling supported, feeling like we're in a safe community with our peers who understand our struggles and stresses. It can help mobilize our fellow Unitarian Universalists and, in fact, our whole faith. In fact, the theme of the UU General Assembly this summer is resist and rejoice. So there we have thousands of people coming together to be mobilized. What else can we bring about by complaining about the difficult state of affairs? We can bring also anger and helplessness. And that is something to be very careful about. It is very harmful to our well-being and to our health. As Gleb said, many of us know that a lot of health conditions, a lot of mental illness is caused by stress, anger, and helplessness. And so it is entirely possible outcome of complaining to feel this way. And here's one thing that you will not bring about by complaining. You will not change in hearts of minds of people who support Donald Trump if you just complain to each other. Just like Gleb was saying earlier, if we discuss with people who support Trump or who are neutral, we might change their minds. So again, think back to your goals. Think back to the future, the world you want to live in. And if that's a world where more people challenge their beliefs and thoughts, you're not going to get that by just complaining to like-minded folks. And our final strategy for today has to do with numbers. Use numbers. Put numbers on your intuitions, make predictions, and then seek data. And here's the example, going back to crime and mental illness. What is the likelihood that a person with mental illness commits a crime due to their mental illness? Now, everyone, just take a moment and make a prediction. Do you think it's like 50%, 20%, I don't know, 95%? So think about it. Now, for extra credit, when you do this at home, write it down. Write it down. You'll be amazed at the intensity of the exercise when you actually write it down, and then you look it up. According to research published by the American Psychological Association, people with serious mental disorders, such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, major depression, the percent of crimes directly related to their illness is 7.5%. And that's just for the folks who are struggling with the worst of the mental illness. For people with less serious mental illness, like the anxiety disorder that I live with and the Gleb's anxiety disorder, much, much less. So if we put our intuitions into numbers, first, of course, we have to catch that the media tells us that mental illness leads to crime. When we notice that, we can make a guess, make a prediction, write it down, and then look it up. This will activate the intentional part of our brain, activate our elephant, And instead of simply going along with what, the intentional rider, it will activate the rider instead of just simply going along with our autopilot. Now, there we have some strategies, and again, this is based on research, this is based on evidence, and our nonprofit organization, Intentional Insights, exists to popularize these strategies. And we're happy to talk to you afterwards about what we do. And I'll be the first to tell you, these strategies are not easy to use, especially at first. This is hard work. We're going against how our mind is set up. We're going against our super strong and super large elephant to try to guide it along with our, very, very inefficient, intellectual, intentional mind. But, with time and practice, these can become habits. Many of us have a habit of brushing our teeth to preserve our mental health, to cough into our elbow, right, to prevent our friends from getting sick. And we don't have to use up any mental energy to do these things. Our autopilot, our elephant, is already used to doing them. And these strategies that I just described, they can also become mental habits to help you be wiser, to help those around you avoid bad decisions that harm your relationships, your business, your civic engagement, that might harm your church activities, and it might even help others avoid electing people like Donald Trump to high office. So to summarize, the wise mind combines the head and the heart, the autopilot, emotional elephant, the intentional, intellectual rider. It's important to notice systematic thinking errors that cause us to make wrong decisions and cause us emotional pain and physical and mental illness and distress. We can use our intentional rider to train our autopilot elephant to have mental habits that address these thinking problems, these thinking errors. This is relevant in all areas of life, in our church life, in our community, in our politics, relationships, mental health, physical health, anywhere. And it's very in line with our UU principles, especially the fourth principle. Now, we talk about this organization that we started, Intentional Insights, and here's a story from the very first days of how it actually got started. We call it the creation story. I don't know the birth story. I'm not sure. But back in January 2014, 3 years ago, Gleb and I were taking a walk in a park in Columbus, Ohio. It was cold. There was lots of snow. I know some folks here might not be very well aware of what snow. It's the white stuff. It comes down. It's slippery. It's cold. It's pretty. It makes things look clean. We're very happy to not be enjoying it for a few days while we're here. So we were walking. We were all bundled up. And Gleb, we're just having another one of our conversations where Gleb was telling me about some interesting research from Daniel Kahneman, from Thinking Fast and Slow. And you see how fat this book is? I'm going to tell you it's very dense. And I was very happy in all these conversations that I was not the one reading it. I might have an MBA and all, but I don't want to be spending my time reading these dense books. I know it might not be a popular opinion, but it's just true. So I was glad to learn from Gleb. And our conversation really turned to, why don't they teach this in school? My life would have been so much more improved if I knew this, 15, 20 years ago, if I knew about these errors and how to solve them, especially. Why aren't there organizations promoting it to everybody? Why isn't this happening? This is so important and useful. And on that particular day in January, we decided, if they don't teach this in school, and there aren't any organizations doing it, why not start one? Why not do it ourselves? If not us, then who? If not now, when? We could continue to be outraged by this problem of lack of public knowledge of these important ideas, or we can pay attention and take action to address this problem. We decided to take action instead of simply being outraged and upset. We decided to change hearts and minds by becoming science popularizers and educators, communicating about this topic to a broad audience like we have here. And today, these actions, 3 years later, they led us to being here and sharing this knowledge with all of you. And I leave you with a final question. How will you use this knowledge to build a world where you want to live?